Psalm 69, starting at verse 6. Lord, the Lord Almighty, may those who hope in you not be disgraced because of me. God of Israel, may those who seek you not be put to shame because of me. For I endure scorn for your sake, and shame covers my face. I am a foreigner to my own family, a stranger to my own mother's children. For zeal for your house consumes me, and the insults of those who insult you fall on me. When I weep and fast, I must endure scorn. When I put on sackcloth, people make sport of me. Those who sit at the gate mock me, and I am the song of the drunkards. And then the second reading is John 19, starting at verse 1, on page 1087. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, "Take him away! Take him away! Crucify him!" "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified.
Thank you, Rachel. Do keep that second reading open, please. We've sung in that lovely song, "Behold him," and that's what we're going to do with God's help now as we watch Jesus in some of the most extraordinary scenes in human history. This is the fourth in a little series following John's Gospel. In John's account of the arrest and the betrayal and the denials of Jesus by Simon Peter, and then last week and this week, the accounts of the trial of Jesus before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. Really, by quite a long way, the longest account of that in the four Gospels. And we saw last week that John describes this trial in 7 scenes which happen at the Praetorium, the palace of the Roman governor. And they alternate between being outside the palace, where Pilate meets with the priests and the Jewish leaders, and inside, where he meets with Jesus. And then outside again, and then inside again, outside again. We looked at the first three last week, and actually we touched on the fourth. But the fourth one, the central scene, is where we're going to begin today. But just before we do, let me say something about how John helps us to see what is really going on. John is particularly brilliant at this, really. One poet in the 19th century said it was a little bit like you look up in the clear sky and you see some points of light, and you think, oh, there are some points of light up in the sky. And then you gradually come to realize that each of those points of light is a magnificent star or a planet. It's some huge heavenly body, something much bigger than you thought it was when you thought it was just a point of light. And John in his gospel does that. He asks us the question, what do you see as you track through these scenes? And it's worth asking the question, what would Pontius Pilate have seen? What would the Roman soldiers have seen? What would the Jewish leaders, the priests and so on, what would they have seen? And what do we see? Because John is wanting to subvert all our ideas. We see things on the outside, on the surface. And he's wanting to say to us, hang on a minute, there's something more going on here. Things that you might think were just like points of light, quite ordinary, mundane things. There's something very big going on. So we join the trial in the middle at the fourth scene, the beginning of chapter 19. We're inside the governor's palace. Pilate takes Jesus inside and he has him flogged. There were various floggings that the Romans used to do. Some were more serious than others. This one may have been one of the less serious floggings, but certainly painful. And then the Roman soldiers, and you can imagine the Roman soldiers just thinking, well, we've got one of these wretched Jews. I dare say they thought pretty poorly about the Jews amongst whom they lived. We've got one of these poor ones. He's a rather pathetic prisoner. Why don't we have a bit of fun? And so they do three things. They crown him, they clothe him, and they hail him. They crown him with a crown of thorns, probably from a thorn bush or a date palm, probably long, hard thorns. And one of the soldiers says, oh, why don't I make a crown from these thorns? And the others say, yes, good idea. Why don't you do that? That'd be a lot of fun. And so they weave together this crown made of these sharp thorns, and then perhaps a different soldier, who knows, shoves it onto the prisoner's head, no doubt drawing blood as he does so. And they all laugh, and they think, oh, this is a tremendous game. And then another one says, why don't we, he's obviously some sort of pretending to be some sort of a king in a rather pathetic way. Why don't we get something? I don't suppose they could actually get hold of the imperial purple, which was fairly carefully guarded, but something approximating to it, perhaps a scarlet or something that looked a little bit like the imperial purple. And somebody found a bit and they draped it round him and they all laughed. Oh, this is a lot of fun. And then they started to hail him. Hail, King of the Jews. And you just imagine the sort of coarse joking going on at the time, and they slapped him in the face again and again and again. And if you asked one of those soldiers at the time, what did you see? I have no doubt he'd say, well, I saw a figure of fun. It was a chance for a good laugh. We have a bit of a rough life, and now we had a chance for a good laugh, and we had a tremendous laugh at his expense. You read that Psalm 69 that Rachel read a little bit of for our first reading, and you begin to get a sense of what it was like in the experience of the Lord Jesus to be insulted and scorned and for shame to cover his face like that. What do you see? And yet John is saying to us, by putting this especially in the middle scene of this trial, what do you see in this coronation? What do you see when you see this man with a crown of thorns, with blood no doubt on his face? You see him draped with this mock purple robe. You see him haled and slapped. That's what you see. And John is saying, maybe there's something more going on here. Maybe this is the king. Maybe in his sufferings, this is how he rules. But we'll follow on to the second scene. So then in verse 4, Pilate goes outside. He comes out again. There's something rather pathetic about Pilate, this very powerful man who has to go in and in and out of his own palace. John is saying to us he's maybe not quite as strong and powerful as everybody thought he was, but he comes out and he says to the Jewish leaders gathered there, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." He said that once before, towards the end of the last chapter in verse 38. I find no basis for a charge against him. And now for a second time, he says, this man is clearly innocent. But he brings him out, and you can imagine this, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. So the Roman soldiers were having their bit of fun, and Pilate acquiesces in it. Let's bring him out like that. And he brings him out like that as a figure of absurd fun. And he says to them, in those what became very famous words in verse 5, "Here is the man. Look, behold the man." And I guess he meant, look, how absurd that this pathetic figure of fun should be guilty. He's absurd, he's weak, he's pathetic, but he's not guilty. He's innocent, and Pilate recognizes that. Here is the man. And again, John says, what do you see? Here is a figure of fun. Here is a pathetic prisoner being badly treated. Or here is the man. Here is the second Adam. Here is the Son of Man. Here is the human being who's going to rule the world. And John is almost saying to us, it's like royalty coming out on the balcony of a palace. We don't know whether it was a balcony or what it was, but it's a little bit like that in our terms. And it's like a public appearance. And you look at it and you think, behind this figure of fun, there is the king who will rule the world. But it doesn't look like that, because in verse 6, as soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted. And you get the first use of this word in John's gospel, this terrible word, crucify. Crucify. And the Gospels don't tell us much about crucifixion because they didn't need to. Because for nearly 300 years after Jesus, and certainly in the time of Jesus, you went around the Roman Empire, you went to a city or town of any size, and outside the town there would be a place of execution. And in that place of execution you would see rough wooden crosses. And if you stayed there and watched, you'd see prisoners made to lie on their backs, stripped naked, nailed through their wrists to the crossed beam, lifted up on the crossed beam so the beam could be fixed to a vertical post, legs twisted so a single nail could be driven through both heels, little piece of wood under the heels, under the feet to prolong the agony so that the prisoner could try to stop themselves being asphyxiated by pushing up on the piece of wood at the bottom, and every time they pushed themselves up, excruciating agony, unimaginable spasms of pain. Everybody knew that this was a horrible form of death. They saw crucifixions. It wasn't a new thing. It wasn't an unknown thing. Everybody knew that when they shouted, "Crucify," that's what they meant. And the events that we see today happen just minutes, really, before the crucifixion begins. At the end of our passage today, Jesus is handed over to be crucified. It's a horrible, horrible death. And they shout, "Crucify him." And Pilate says, I don't quite know what this means in verse 6, "You take him and crucify him," which obviously they couldn't do because they didn't have that authority. It's a sort of joke, perhaps, and maybe they know he's joking. But again he says, I find no basis for a charge against him. 3 times, he's innocent, he's innocent, he's innocent. And in that lies his greatness. Here is one who will rule the world, because as the innocent one, not just innocent of the charges against him here, but profoundly innocent, he's going to die the death on behalf of the guilty. And they say, the Jewish leaders insisted, we have a law, and according to that law, he must die. He claimed to be the Son of God. And the Son of God was a title used in the Old Testament of the kings in David's line. Sometimes a Roman emperor would claim that sort of title, Son of God. So it had all sorts of connotations. He claimed to be Son of God. But Pilate seems to be to begin perhaps to grasp that there's something more going on than politics here. And we read in verse 8, he's afraid, he's very afraid, or even more afraid. He's frightened. He's frightened because he has a bad conscience. He's frightened because he's beginning to realize that there's something going on here that he doesn't understand, that's bigger than him, that speaks a different language from the language of human power that he understands, the language that the chief priests understand, the language that Barabbas understands, the language that every human being by nature understands, the language of human force and power. And Pilate is beginning to see that there's something going on here, and he's frightened. And so he goes back inside for the next scene, verse 9. And he says to Jesus, he asks Jesus what is perhaps the most important question in John's Gospel: where do you come from? Where do you come from? You get that again and again in John's Gospel. We're told in chapter 1, verse 18, that he's lived in the bosom of the Father, in intimate relations with the Father, as the Son to the Father from all eternity. That's where he comes from. In chapter 8, Jesus says, I know where I come from and where I'm going. In chapter 9, they say of Jesus, as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. In chapter 13, before the foot washing, we read that he knew he had come from God and was returning to God. I know where I come from. Where do you come from? Who are you? Such an important question in human history. So much rests on the answer to that question. And Jesus gives him no answer. That extraordinary dignified silence that will be seen in this evening's passage, the prophecy of Isaiah 53, to be an echo of that. In the previous time, he's met with Pontius Pilate. In the second scene in last week, Jesus said, everyone on the side of truth listens to me, but Pilate won't listen to him, so there's no point speaking. It would be pearls before swine, and so he stands silent. Where do you come from? And there is this eloquent silence. And you wonder who's on trial. John says, what do you see? You see a powerful man interrogating a weak man. And you're beginning to wonder who's really on trial, whose judgments, whose decisions are going to be judged in the centuries that follow. Well, Pilate begins to bluster in verse 10. Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize I've got power to free you or to crucify you? Don't you understand that any minute now I'm going to pass judgment, and either you'll be set free or you'll be crucified? Don't you understand that? And Jesus says, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. And maybe Pilate thinks, well, yes, sure, it's given to me from above by the emperor. But that's not what Jesus means. This is a power given to all human authorities by God. And therefore, he says, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin. Now, there's nothing anti-Semitic about that. The New Testament insists that there was something terribly serious about what the Jewish leaders of Jesus' day did. And the difference is not that it's a Jewish thing. Jesus is a Jew. All the first Christians were Jews. It's not an anti-Semitic thing. The point is this, I think, that Pilate is going to sin. He's going to go against the truth. He's going to sign the death warrant for crucifixion of a man he's 3 times declared to be innocent. He knows to be innocent. So he does wrong. There's no question about that. But the Jewish leaders know the scriptures. They have the words of God. They have the temple worship. They have Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They have the promises of God. They have the covenant of God. And they know so much more, and they ought to know, and therefore they're guilty of a greater sin. It's not because they're Jewish. And the same warning would come to anybody today who knows their Bible, been brought up in a Christian family. You know the Bible, you know the story, you know these things, you've been taught these things, you've been in church. And if you do what they did to Jesus, then it's a greater sin. So that, I think, is the point of what's going on there. Well, we come to the final scene in verse 12. And there's this pathetic comment that from then on Pilate is trying to set Jesus free. Here is this most powerful man in the land, the only man who has the power of life and death, the representative of the Roman emperor, and he's trying to set Jesus free, and he can't. And we'll see how this most powerful man, who is so strong, knows that Jesus is innocent, but they get him into a place where he signs his death warrant, and they keep shouting. And what they shout is so clever and so profound. If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar, the emperor. You're no friend of Caesar. Later on, the title friend of Caesar became almost an official designation of somebody who was in the inner circle of the emperor's good books. May not have been that at this stage, but to be a friend of Caesar, to be in Caesar's good books, to be in favor with the most powerful man in the known world. And it's very, very clever, their comment, because they're saying, if you let this man, who claims to be a king and claims to be the Son of God, if you let this man, who is clearly a rival to Caesar, if you let him go free, Caesar might get to hear of it, and then he might get to hear of a whole lot of other things that you've been doing. Pilate has a very bad conscience with plenty of good reason. And Caesar might get to hear of all sorts of things you've been doing, and Caesar might not like it. And then you might be in all sorts of trouble, which indeed is what happened to Pilate a little bit later in his career, if you can call it a career. And so they say, anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. You can't possibly let him go. And at that point, Pilate capitulates. He brings Jesus out, verse 13. And we're told with great solemnity, he sits down in the position of authority and judgment in the culture of the day. He sits down on the judge's seat, and we're told the place, it's called the stone pavement in Greek. We're told what it's called in Aramaic. There's something very solemn about this moment, as Pilate, the most powerful man in the land, sits on the judgment seat at a place that is named in 2 languages. And we're told the day again, the day of preparation of the Passover. And we're told the time, the 6th hour, about noon, about midday. We're told so much about this defining moment. And as John tells this, and you see this powerful man sitting on the judgment seat in the position of authority, it's like a throne almost. And you see this pathetic prisoner with the crown of thorns. And you say, what do I see? Well, I see a powerful man about to condemn an innocent, pathetic figure to death. And John says, yes, but what do you see? Who is really being judged? Whose actions are going to be judged in the years ahead? Who is actually the judge? Who is going to rule the world and judge the world? Well, he brings him out, And he says to them again, "Here is your king," I think probably in a mocking tone of voice. "This is the best you can manage for a king, you pathetic lot. This figure here." And they shout again, take him away, crucify him." And Pilate says, "Shall I crucify your king? Do you really want me to do that?" And then in a reply that is dripping with irony, they reply, "We have no king but Caesar." That's extraordinary. These men who have asked for the freeing of Barabbas, who is a rebel and a violent criminal and terrorist against the Roman power. And now they say, no, we have no king but Caesar. And yet it's profoundly true, because actually the only power that they acknowledge is human power, and Caesar is the most powerful human power. That's the world they live in. They live in a world where power counts. They understand that language. We have no king but Caesar. We're supposed to be praying for the kingdom of God. We're supposed to owe our allegiance to the God of Israel and to his Messiah. But actually, we have no king but Caesar. Every time we're faced with a decision between power in the world and the way the world treats power and God's crowned with thorns king, we'll always go for Caesar. We'll always go for the power of the world. And if a stronger than Caesar comes along, we'll bow before him. We'll always bow before the strong men of the day. We have no king but Caesar. So what is going on? As Pilate in verse 16 hands him over to them to be crucified. Of course, he hands him over to the Roman crucifixion squad. But John says he hands him over to them, that is, to the Jewish leaders. They're the ones who'd handed Jesus over to him, and now in effect he hands him over to them so that the Roman crucifixion squad can do what they want. So what's going on? What do you and I make of this? It's an extraordinary drama, and it undermines all human ideas of power. And when those ideas of power get into the church, the Christian church, and the Christian church begins to think in terms of what's going to impress people, wouldn't it be lovely to belong to a church which would impress people, where you could say to people, I belong to this church, and they'd say, wow, that's an impressive church. That's a powerful church. That's a strong church. That's a rich church. That's a talented church. All the ways in which the world treats celebrity and power. And we would love that. And this completely undermines it. It says, you look at Pontius Pilate, who stands for all of that. You look at the chief priests who stand for all of that. And you look at this pathetic prisoner. And John says to us, what do you see? Who is the king? And in the passage that follows in the crucifixion, we will see that king lifted up onto his throne, onto the cross. And as he's lifted up onto that throne, he's lifted up onto the place from which he will rule the world, from which he will gather all kinds of people to himself. Because on that throne, that strange, paradoxical, ugly, horrible throne of weakness and suffering and innocent punishment, he will bear the sins of sinners, and he will take the sting out of death. And he will make forgiveness of sins possible. And he will do what no Pontius Pilate, or even the stronger versions of Pontius Pilate in human history, he will do what none of them can do. He will do what it takes to rule the world. What do you see? Now, my friends, I think it's important for us, for the cross of Christ to be our message. We want it to be what people will hear when they come to our meetings. But it's more than that. We want it to be what people will see, that they see in the way we live as Christians, the way we live as a Christian church, that our method is the method of the cross, that we are unashamed to work through weakness and what the world sees as despicable and pathetic, that they'll see that in our lifestyle, denying self and taking up the cross and following Jesus. And they'll see it in Christian ministry and service. A friend of mine, just last Thursday, was given the great responsibility in northern Nigeria of being one of the bishops. And we've been corresponding, and the service at which he's given this responsibility of being a bishop in northern Nigeria is called, as it often is, an enthronement, which is a word that can be very easily abused. And I emailed him, I said, we're praying today, this was on Thursday, as you begin this responsibility in Zaria in northern Nigeria. And I said, I've been pondering enthronement in the light of the crown of thorns, and reflecting that the only enthronement in Christian ministry is, like his in Zaria, to a crown of thorns, denying self, taking up the cross, serving the people of God, paying the price of service in humility and sacrifice. And I said, I'm so glad to think of you doing that, as I know you will. And he replied and said, yes, that's exactly right. That's what enthronement is. Enthronement for Jesus is to be lifted up on the cross. Enthronement in Christian service is to be lifted up in the way of the cross. With the crown, we follow the man with the crown of thorns. So, my friends, at this Easter season, I hope that, like me, this passage will have helped you too, as we sang in that song, to behold him. And not just to behold him and to see what's there on the surface, but to see what's really going on. And to see that in the crown of thorns, this innocent man, this one who is the Son of God, this one who dies a death of shame for sinners, that this is the man who rules the world. This is the King. This is the one before whom Pontius Pilate must bow, the one before whom Caesar, the Roman emperor, must bow, the one before whom every powerful human being in history must bow, the one who will one day return in glory and judge the world. And our calling, if we're Christian people, is to walk in his footsteps. Those who follow the man with the crown of thorns. And like him, there may be times when people think very little of us. They may ridicule us, they may mock us. In many parts of the world, they will do more than that. I think of a friend of mine who's here this morning from another part of the world who was telling me just this week of the persecution against Christians where he lives. Much, much worse than anything that we have here. But it shouldn't surprise us, because we walk in the footsteps of the man with the crown of thorns. Let's be quiet for a moment and I'll pray. Here is the man. Behold the man. Lord Jesus, we want to behold you in your shame and mockery, and to behold you with adoration and worship and thanksgiving, and to resolve in our hearts to walk in your footsteps in the way of the cross. We ask it for Jesus' sake. Amen.